and welcome back to Long Dog Book Reviews. I'm Shelby and this is Kiwi, and today, keeping in with the Stephen King theme, we'll be discussing yet another short story, and that is The Boogeyman from the 1978 Night Shift anthology. This story I read for the first time about 12 years ago, and it's always stuck with me, not so much because of the titular monster, but because the protagonist is a monster in his own right. It follows the story of 28-year-old Lester Billings, a divorced man who just lost his 3 children, all before the age of 4, and he's talking to a therapist in the hopes that he can unburden some of his guilt and convince the therapist that it was not him who killed his children, but it was a supernatural entity called the Boogeyman. Lester is a very unreliable narrator. He talks about his wife Rita in a very condescending way, and that's putting it mildly. He alludes to being abusive. He talks very dismissively about his children. He talks in grandiose terms about himself. Lester talks to Dr. Harper, the therapist, and he discusses his life with Rita early on in their marriage after their first son, Denny, was born. And when Denny was about 1, he started having night terrors and pointing at the closet, which mysteriously was always left ajar, and saying, "Boogeyman, Daddy, Boogeyman." So Lester doesn't understand this, and he blames Rita at first for putting this word into his kid's head. And eventually he dies in his crib, and the doctors attribute it to sudden infant death syndrome, which is sadly a real cause of death for many infants even today. And the rates were a lot higher when the story was written, which was in the 1970s. Later on, when they have their daughter, Shirley, she does the same thing. She'll point at the closet, she'll say this word that neither of them know how she learned, and one day she swallows her own tongue. And again, this is described in a very unsavory way. And the doctors attribute it to a convulsion. So Lester is immediately suspicious because he says that kids don't just have convulsions, that kids can be scared into convulsions. So once again, he's convinced that his child was killed by the supernatural entity. So Rita starts to go into a depression, which is again described in a very dismissive kind of way. In one of the more adult passages, Lester alludes to their sex life by saying that it was very normal and didn't include any of that dirty stuff. Now, this is a bit of a head scratcher. I don't know what kind of things a person like Lester would consider to be dirty stuff, but my gut tells me probably anything that wasn't centered directly on his pleasure. But that's just a side note. I think it's another thing that was meant to show what kind of person he was. And I think that had this movie been made 20 years ago, and had the director decided to follow the story a little bit more closely, there's one actor who I think could have played this role very well, Michael Shannon.
No siblings, Zelda?
No, sir.
That's not common, is it, for your people?
This creature is intelligent, capable of language, of understanding emotions.
So are the Soviets, the gooks, and we still kill them, don't we? I bet I could make you squawk a little.
He's very good at playing this kind of character. I've seen him do it in Shape of Water, and maybe he's done it in other movies, I'm not really sure, but he just embodies this caricature of 1950s to 1970s quote-unquote normalcy very well. And again, it's a caricature. That's one other thing I'd like to say that I think might be a little bit controversial, is that I don't attribute any of Lester's awfulness to the time period. I was born in the 90s, but I've known enough people who grew up in the 70s or who lived through the 70s and 80s to know that this kind of thinking was not considered normal. I think it's meant to illustrate just what a terrible person Lester was, and I don't think that this kind of language or this kind of thought process was commonplace in the 70s at all, no matter what part of the US you were living in. So after their 3rd child is born, Andy, and again he blames Rita for this, saying that she failed with her birth control, and he always tries to get the therapist, Dr. Harper, to sympathize with him, which I thought was interesting. He says things like, "Oh, I know how that sounds, but you'll have to remember that I've been through a lot," as if his wife hadn't gone through all the same things. And Rita just seems like the most normal kind of person. Like, reading the story, I almost kind of felt like I was reading the poem My Last Duchess, where the narrator is describing someone who is a very good person, but he describes it in such a disdainful and contemptuous way that you know immediately what's really going on, but you feel like he's still trying to get you to sympathize with him, which I thought was just, like, that's a very good literary technique. I appreciate that from King. So at the end of the story, he leaves to make another appointment with a therapist. The reception desk is empty, so he goes back and then discovers that the therapist had been the Boogeyman all along. I've noticed this, my husband has noticed this, and King has even admitted this himself, that his endings are the hardest part to write, and sometimes they end up being a bit on the cheesy side, which I think this was. So following the plot of the movie, it doesn't follow Lester Billings as much. He is a character, but he's a minor character. It actually follows Dr. Will Harper, and his family, namely his teenage daughter Sadie and his younger daughter Sawyer. So they've just lost their mother in a car accident, and he's having some difficulty communicating with them about it. This movie focuses very heavily on grief.
You never talk about it.
I wasn't at the accident. So there's no one I had to talk to.
It just doesn't feel real. I keep thinking she's gonna come through that door with a cardamom tea that smells like shit.
In the short story, grief doesn't have that much to do with the boogeyman itself. It's kind of hinted at that the boogeyman does latch onto grief, or it does go after people who are vulnerable in some way. But in the movie, it's very clear that this monster feeds on grief. So when Lester Billings arrives to see Dr. Harper, he talks about losing his first child to SIDS, and then his 2 subsequent children just died mysteriously in their cribs, and he was convinced that it was this boogeyman who did it. And he's a lot more sympathetic in the movie.
Is this your first time seeing a therapist?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't we start with why you decided to see one now?
I didn't know where else to go. You know, I can't go to a priest because I'm not Catholic. I can't go to a lawyer because I didn't commit a crime, even if everybody thinks I have. Even if they all think I did it.
You did what, exactly?
Kill my kids. One at a time. Kill them all.
He's just clearly a grieving man, so that's a big character change. Once Lester comes into the house, that, along with the family's shared grief, invites the boogeyman into their lives. And this entity can only exist in the shadows, which I think was a very big plot hole, and I know other reviewers have pointed this out as well, that they just never seem to want to turn on the lights, even though that seems to be a pretty quick fix solution. But then we wouldn't have a movie, so there's that. It also follows Sadie and her group of friends and how she gets bullied because of her grieving process, which includes wearing her mother's clothes, things like that. And just once, I'd like to see the mean girl in a movie not be blonde.
Maybe it's my mom's.
Are you sure that's a good idea?
Why am I sure what's a good idea?
I just wearing her clothes, it seems like it might make it harder to move on or whatever.
I don't want to move on.
Maybe you don't want to creep people out either.
Come on.
What?
That's not...
I'm just trying to help.
I don't know why it's always blonde. There's a lot of kind of stereotypes in this movie, and parts of it do feel a little bit on the dated side, but I think that almost might have been intentional. It feels like it could have come out in like the early 2010s, and it would have been right at home. Like any of those found footage movies with a lot of jump scares, because this movie is very heavy on the jump scares. But again, it includes just enough homages to the short story.
Hey, it's Rita Billings, Lester's wife.
What do you want?
I found a way to get rid of it.
The story also includes Lester's wife, Rita, who has much more agency in the movie. They kind of turn her into this like paranoid redneck woman. There's no hints that they ever had a bad marriage, so that's a big difference from the short story. But she's hiding out in their house. The house is in complete ruin, and she carries a shotgun and has hallways full of candles to keep the boogeyman away. And she also sets a trap for him at one point involving Sadie, using her as bait. So that's a whole thing as well. I'm glad that they at least included the wife, because I think that was an important part of the story, and even if they changed her character a lot, I did appreciate that. This is one thing I noticed as well when my husband and I were watching Dexter New Blood, is that I think that screenwriters try to make teen dialogue as generic as possible, partly because it just changes so frequently, because if they use language that only one generation uses or is only popular for a couple of years, it's going to seem dated very shortly. So I think they just try to make it as bland and as straightforward as possible, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think if anything, it's probably a smart decision.
What are you doing?
I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on. Come on, I'm your best friend.
You were my best friend. Now you have all these new friends who are so much cooler.
That is not true. They're your friends too.
There was some dialogue in this movie that I don't think was super realistic. But people don't talk in real life the way they do in movies anyway, so it wasn't a huge deal. Sophie Thatcher gives a great performance. I wouldn't say this movie was absolutely stellar. I'd say it was decent. It was better than I thought it would be. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this review. Let me know what you thought of the short story or of the movie, and we'll see you next time. Bye!